I've been using an iPad Pro exclusively for everything for over a month now. I will tell you what my plans are with the iPad as a whole at the end of my synopsis, and it's not what you think it is. I've done now 7 videos, 9 podcast episodes, and released 1 song for streaming, all on this very iPad. And outside of doing all the important stuff as a creator, I've also done all the leisure things on this iPad, like watching YouTube, applying for jobs, social media, light gaming. I'm not a gamer, but I'll play like Clash of Clans or something. I've done my finances and investments on this iPad. I've also done extensive researching on this device, whether it's for YouTube videos or events in my life. I also can't forget about the FaceTiming, did a lot of FaceTiming on this thing. And let's not forget about the art creation, like the thumbnails for these videos or album art covers. And lastly, and most importantly, Logic. The culmination of everything that I was doing was leading up to doing a Logic song, being able to write it and release it and do all the things on this iPad. That was the last video. So I won't go too far in depth with Logic this video, but everything was leading up to that. That was the climax of everything. So now that everything has been said and done about not just Logic, but all those subjects, let's talk about the nuances of iPadOS. Let's talk about the minutia about using this device. For starters, Stage Manager. I've talked about this in the other videos reviewing this, but Stage Manager makes so much more sense on an iPad than it does on macOS. It's just cleaner. It's kind of hard to describe, but because there is no desktop equivalent for iPadOS, having a Stage Manager kind of makes it feel like there is, especially when you're able to manipulate windows so cleanly. And that only amplifies even more when I was using my studio display. Plugging in this iPad with Stage Manager into this studio display actually opened up the whole platform. It felt like for me using the OS. That's when it felt the most like I was using a Mac. Or maybe another way of saying that is that's when it felt the most that I wasn't using iPadOS. But I can't just say it was only when I was using Stage Manager or the studio display. It's also when I was using the Magic Keyboard. This configuration feels so optimized, and I know it costs extra because it's an accessory, but my god, the keyboard case with the Apple Pencil completes the whole ensemble, and it actually feels complete at a cost. But everything that I was doing on the iPad when I was using this form factor right here, which was at least 90% of the time, it felt so intuitive. It felt like I was just using another computer. But there's something to appreciate and to be said about just using the iPad as an iPad with none of the accessories attached to it, especially when I was holding it in the portrait orientation. This was a very clean, light, and just fun experience because now you have to use your finger like you do on your phone, but you have such a nicer, more optimized screen real estate for this experience. There was a lot of time when I was just using this device as like this, and it was okay. It was quite enjoyable. But then lastly as well, I did actually unpair my Magic Keyboard and Magic Mouse, and I repaired it from the Mac to the iPad, and that was the best experience for me. I think having an Apple-made mouse and keyboard that's external from the keyboard case is the little extra icing on the top of this iPad cake, and it makes it, for a lack of a better word, complete. I'm a mouse user personally, so whenever I had an opportunity to use the mouse, it was more intuitive for me and a cleaner experience for me than it would be if I was using the trackpad. So we have all these combinations of what we can do with the iPad, from mouse to trackpad to Magic Keyboard with the trackpad to just the touch interface or the Apple Pencil. Those are 5 different input methods that you could do on the iPad, and they all work very, very well. I personally like having the options for my different circumstances of when I was using the iPad. Now let's talk about my peripherals that go with the iPad that aren't Apple made, that had to be used for my experience, starting with my audio preamp. For whatever reason, this thing works the best when it's plugged directly into the iPad, which maybe makes sense because it's supposed to be a Thunderbolt port. The issue I kept running into is that either my mic wouldn't work, or because it requires power to activate it, sometimes it would just turn off, and it had 0 chance of working if it was plugged into the studio display. The problem is, all of this works just fine on my MacBook Pro. So to say that I was frustrated because I didn't get the full experience the same way for something that I use all the time is an understatement. But then that leads me to the next thing, my USB-C hub. This thing worked great. I love using the USB-C hub. I was able to record directly from my Sony to the iPad, which was sick. I was able to use the SD card reader for when I was recording directly onto the Sony and then get the full 4K experience. And going back to my preamp, I was able to plug it into my USB-C hub, and then at least I knew for sure my audio for my over-ear headphones, these guys right here, would work just fine. So for the whole USB-C ecosystem, 10 out of 10 would recommend. Moving over to software, the first thing I needed to figure out was how was I going to replace OBS Studio. I received comments to download the Camo app, and thank you for everybody who did because it worked flawlessly. My main takeaway from using the Camo app was that of just being able to replace really any application for Mac. There is an iPad equivalent for something, so there was no shortage of having the tools out there to get done what you need to get done in the creative space. But speaking of apps, something I had to work around, not every iOS or iPadOS application was optimized the same way it would be if I was using a .com version on Mac. Specifically what I'm talking about is using the YouTube Studio and uploading audio for podcast streaming listening experience. To get the full 100% unlocked experience, I had to go through the .coms of these things, which I'm just glad that you're able to do that on this device. Great, so one less thing you need from Mac. But I would obviously absolutely love having an app version for all this instead, just because it makes the experience feel cleaner. Speaking of cleaner experiences, let's talk about navigating the UI. Sometimes straight up it was just easier to use a touch input or the touch interface over using like the trackpad or a mouse for it. Things were just optimized for pinching or zooming, swiping up features, or really anything that you would do on your iPhone. It just had the same continuity over on iPad. But then the frustrating part is sometimes it was easier and better just to use a mouse for scrolling, especially on something like the Magic Mouse where you can scroll up and down, left and right. It was very intuitive just to have that same engagement when I was using the studio display with the iPad. Something that's not as clean and a little bit clunky, even though I understand why, is the multiple steps to get to the same result. The one example that I keep using is like using 2 steps to minimize a window instead of just clicking to minimize. When using the touch interface, so you're just using your finger, it makes sense as to why, because our fingers are thick and wider and it's not precise like a mouse, I get it. But when it's plugged into the studio display and I'm using the mouse and keyboard, I would absolutely love having that same precision, which means get rid of the redundancy. You don't need 2 steps to minimize the window at that point. That's where I sometimes look for more macOS features just ported over to iPad when it's plugged in through Thunderbolt. That would make sense to me. The whole Thunderbolt port being used for the studio display was such a game changer and eye-opening experience for me. I don't have that on my 2018 iPad. But the moment it was being used to push my screen real estate to the display and having all this room to work with, it was so similar to Mac. I can't reiterate enough that it just didn't feel like I was using iPadOS. Many times I would forget that I was using an iPad. I said this very quickly in my last video about Logic, but I did notice there was 2 audio outputs when I was using the Logic app and I was watching YouTube. I was getting 2 different audio outputs. Something I thought was just completely impossible to do on iPad showed me that it is possible. So I would like to see that pushed to everything, system-wide. I don't know if that's on Apple or the developers, but somebody somewhere needs to make this a thing. We need to draw more attention to that. So with that, I see all the setbacks that come with using iPadOS. I just didn't care. Almost. A weird bug that I was experiencing was that I would plug my iPhone into the studio display to charge it while I was working off of the iPad as well on the studio display. And every single time, it didn't matter what would happen, it happens every time, I would get the trust this computer prompt. And I'm just like, just go away. Yes, just this. So that was a bug or something. I don't know. I didn't like it. And talking about bugs, Logic was buggy for me. It doesn't have all the features like the macOS version does, but it does have cool plugins that I don't believe is on the Mac version. Things like piano tunes or the synths, etc. And something that I found like irritating as a whole was like the volume control on my iPad for the studio display. The back and forthing with that, it's not intuitive, it's not clean. Way better experience on macOS. But yeah, that's it. This whole experience made me want to upgrade my iPad and keep this one. That is up until my last video. For whatever reason, that last video about Logic, I could not import that footage into LumaFusion. There's a good chance it's because I am running the iPadOS 18 beta, so that is on me, but it did make me stop and reflect. I had to edit off of my Mac again, and oh my God, it was so much smoother of an experience. Everything about macOS is just smoother. I actually miss using my MacBook Pro. I miss doing deeper, more intricate projects, like using Logic. And if you're watching this part of the video, that means I had to edit this video on the Mac again, which means the iPad is starting to lose me in this whole post-production experience again. But also, like I said, it may be very well because I'm running the iPad beta right now. I don't know. So, am I going to keep this iPad and continue working with my current setup? No. But here's what I am going to do. And here's the big twist of it all. This experience was so eye-opening for me. It made me reevaluate how I run this channel. Show? Network? What do I call this whole thing? Anyways, I've learned so much about my production that there are changes coming to this workflow starting immediately after this video. I am going to double down on using my MacBook actually, because I'm going to be returning this M1 iPad Pro, and I'm going to be selling my 2018 iPad Pro as well. That's right, I am shrinking my ecosystem and I am going all in on my Mac. For now, because over the next few months, I'm going to be saving up for an 11-inch M4 iPad Pro. During my time with this iPad, I actually went back to my Apple store and I spent a decent amount of time getting hands-on with the current iPad Pros over there. At this point, the honeymoon phase was over for me. I was just using the iPad as a tool. But I found something so satisfying with the 11-inch iPad Pro. I love that thing. And the thing is, I still love using the Apple Pencil and the Magic Keyboard case. I actually see a scenario where an iPad is my primary computer.
What's a computer?
What's a computer? And what I loved about using this iPad over the last month was the extreme portability of the whole experience, this whole thing. See, my Mac stays here in my studio. I bought this MacBook Pro back when I was moving cross-country. I went from California to Virginia, then Virginia to Colorado. I was very on the go over the last couple years. But before I had this, I actually had a 2015 iMac. And now that I'm pretty sure I'm done moving for the foreseeable future, at least God, I hope so, I wouldn't be surprised if I see myself eventually upgrading from this device to a Mac Mini or a Mac Studio. Because the Mac is my core foundation to this whole ecosystem. That still hasn't changed. But I have. For all the moving around that I do in my house, and I have a decent sized house, I'd much rather have something this portable with me, on me, at all times. Especially for those day-to-day functions I was telling you about at the beginning of this video. And when I really need to get into the weed of things, I have All Reliable here still. Like I said in the Logic for iPad video, we are so close to bridging this gap, like this close. I actually think it's inevitable. I am very optimistic about the iPad's future. It already does everything just fine for basic consumers. And now I've shown that it can do everything for content creators as well with no compromise to the outcome. It's just getting from idea to release that needs some fine tuning. But hey, I can say the same thing about myself too. Everything is a work in progress. You just have to decide at which point are you willing to say, okay, this is good enough. And for the M series iPads, they are definitely good enough for a content creator.